Hello, everyone. For the second episode of this podcast, I figured I would read a story by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, who are more commonly known as the Brothers Grimm. And you know what? They just might happen to be my favorite fairy tale writers. Sorry to Hans Christian Andersen, who I also greatly admire, but don't worry, I have big plans for him for the finale of this season. Not that I want to spoil anything. Anyway, since there are so many stories by the Grimm Bros, that's my nickname for them, by the way, and please let me know if that sounds stupid. It was at first a difficult decision to make. In the end, I decided to go with not only one of my favorite stories by the Grimm Bros, but one of my favorite stories in general, the Six Swans. Unlike Cinderella, which was the previous story I read and discussed in the very first episode, the Six Swans doesn't have too much history to dig up. I'm also not entirely sure if this story is very well known throughout the rest of the world, or let alone the United States, where I live, since most of the literary versions of this story are confined to Europe, whereas Cinderella's story has spread to most of the continents. Of course, there are a few variants of this story in Asia and Africa, but other than that, the story was most predominantly known throughout Europe. In regards to the Arne Thompson Uther Index for categorizing folktales, the Six Swans fall under the tale type 451, which is titled The Maiden Who Seeks Her Brothers. The Grimms have quite a handful of this tale type in their collection. Besides the Six Swans, they also have the 7 Ravens and the 12 Brothers. So they seem to have a fondness for this tale type, which stresses family fidelity. Of course, these stories of a maiden searching for her brothers existed long before the Grimm's time. In fact, the earliest literary version I could find is The Seven Doves from Giambattista Basile's The Pentamerone. To anyone who speaks Italian, I apologize for any mispronunciation. I swear, you're gonna hear me apologizing for my mispronunciation in literally almost every episode of this podcast. If you want to go even further back, there's a legend from Irish mythology called the Children of Lear, and while this legend doesn't count as a 451 tale, it bears similarities. Even after the Grimm Bros wrote down the Six Swans, there have been other variants that were written down after it. In Norway, there was The 12 Wild Ducks by Peter Christian Abjornsen, and, oh my gosh, Jorgen Ingebretsen Mo. Once again, I apologize for any mispronunciation. I figured I would point that out before anyone else does in the comments section. Also, all of Norway is probably angry at me. Anyway, Hans Christian Andersen himself wrote his own version called The Wild Swans, and his version is the one that introduced me to this tale type. I even considered reading Andersen's version before the Grimm's, yet decided otherwise, since the Grimm's version gave me more to work with in regards to commentary. Aside from that, there are some parts of the Grimm's version that I prefer over Andersen's and vice versa. So, maybe I'll revisit this tale type with the Wild Swans. Before we begin, though, I wanted to point out that the Grimm's oral source for this story was Dorothea Wilde, also known as Dorchen Wilde, who eventually became the wife of Wilhelm Grimm. I just thought that was an awesome fact to point out. With that out of the way, let's get to reading The Six Swans by the Brothers Grimm. Once upon a time, a certain king was hunting in a great forest, and he chased a wild beast so eagerly that none of his attendants could follow him. When evening drew near, he stopped and looked around him, and then he saw that he had lost his way. He sought a way out, but could find none. Then he perceived an aged woman with a head which nodded perpetually, who came towards him. But she was a witch. "Good woman," said he to her, "can you not show me the way through the forest?"
"Oh, yes, Lord King," she answered. "That I certainly can, but on one condition, and if you do not fulfill that, you will never get out of the forest and will die of hunger in it."
"That's it, lady, just wave that red flag!" "What kind of condition is it?" asked the king.
"I have a daughter," said the old woman, "who is as beautiful as anyone in the world, and well deserves to be your consort. And if you will make her your queen, I will show you the way out of the forest."
In the anguish of his heart, the king consented, and the old woman led him to her little hut, where her daughter was sitting by the fire. She received the king as if she had been expecting him, and he saw that she was very beautiful. But still, she did not please him, and he could not look at her without secret horror. After he had taken the maiden up on his horse, the old woman showed him the way, and the king reached his royal palace again, where the wedding was celebrated. What I find interesting here is that the maiden is beautiful, yet the king is secretly afraid of her. As I mentioned in the previous episode, and probably future episodes whenever this phrase is brought up, beauty is supposed to represent virtue in fairy tales. So to have a king dislike a maiden, even though she's beautiful, is a nice break from the trope. Also, with this story, and Snow White as great examples, beauty doesn't always equal goodness. In fact, I noticed that if a maiden is described as beautiful in a fairy tale, she's either virtuous or vain, one of the two V's. The king had already been married once, and had by his first wife 7 children, 6 boys and a girl, whom he loved better than anything else in the world. Don't worry, people, too many children is a common occurrence in fairy tales. In fact, I'm pretty sure that the most children you can have in a fairy tale is, 12? It could be higher. As he now feared that the stepmother might not treat them well, and even do them some injury, he took them to a lonely castle which stood in the midst of a forest. It lay so concealed, and the way was so difficult to find that he himself would not have found it, if a wise woman had not given him a ball of yarn with wonderful properties. When he threw it down before him, it unrolled itself and showed him his path. All right, there's a few things to talk about here. First, it's no wonder that the king didn't like his new wife. He probably got the memo that he was in a fairy tale and knew that she would be a stepmother. And we know what stepmothers do in fairy tales. Second, I love how he goes out of his way to protect his children, because here's the thing about parents in fairy tales. They're really bad at parenting, in case you couldn't tell from when I read Cinderella. They could be abusive or neglectful, and even the parents who genuinely love their children somehow end up getting them into danger, usually by abandoning them or giving them away to strange people, like in the case of Rapunzel, Rumpelstiltskin, and even Beauty and the Beast. Also, that magic ball of yarn reminds me of the string that Theseus uses to escape the labyrinth in Greek mythology. That, however, is a story to share for another time. The king, however, went so frequently away to his dear children that the queen observed his absence. She was curious and wanted to know what he did when he was quite alone in the forest. She gave a great deal of money to his servants, and they betrayed the secret to her, and told her likewise of the ball which alone could point out the way. And now she knew no rest until she had learnt where the king kept the ball of yarn. And then she made little shirts of white silk, and as she had learnt the art of witchcraft from her mother, she sewed a charm inside them. And once when the king had ridden forth to hunt, she took the little shirts and went into the forest, and the ball showed her the way. The children, who saw from a distance that someone was approaching, thought that their dear father was coming to them, and full of joy ran to meet him. Then she threw one of the little shirts over each of them, and no sooner had the shirts touched their bodies than they were changed into swans, and flew away over the forest. Thus we get the title of the story, The Six Swans. No matter what version you read, the brothers are normally turned into some type of bird, whether it's swans, ravens, or even ducks. In The Wild Swans, Anderson writes that the queen wanted to turn the princes into ugly birds, but they instead turned into beautiful swans. In this version, the queen seemed to have intended to turn them into swans, especially when you consider that the shirts were white. I find this interesting since swans symbolize beauty and purity. There are also other stories about people transforming into swans. For one thing, there are tales of maidens who turn into swans by wearing their feathers and skins, until some jackass man steals the swan skin, forcing the woman to become his wife, kind of like the Selkie from Celtic folklore. And of course, there's the story of Swan Lake, one of the most famous ballets. By the way, The Swan Princess is based on that ballet, in case you were wondering. I love that movie. And I've cosplayed as Odette. The queen went home quite delighted, and thought she had got rid of her stepchildren. But the girl had not run out with her brothers, and the queen knew nothing about her. Next day the king went to visit his children, but he found no one but the little girl. "Where are thy brothers?" asked the king.
"Alas, dear father,"
she answered,
"they have gone away and left me alone."
and she told him that she had seen from her little window how her brothers had flown away over the forest in the shape of swans, and she showed him the feathers, which they had let fall in the courtyard, and which she had picked up. The king mourned, but he did not think that the queen had done this wicked deed, and as he feared that the girl would also be stolen away from him, he wanted to take her away with him. But she was afraid of her stepmother, and entertained the king to let her stay just this one night more in the forest castle. The poor girl thought,
"I can no longer stay here. I will go and seek my brothers."
And when night came, she ran away and went straight into the forest. And now we get to the main plot point of this tale type, 451, in which the maiden seeks her brothers. Remember when I mentioned the Children of Lear, that legend from Irish mythology? Well, that story also has an evil stepmother queen who turns her stepchildren into swans. But since the daughter also gets cursed, that story doesn't count as this tale type, since she doesn't go out to seek her brothers. Let's go ahead and talk about the sister in this story. Not only is she the youngest sibling, but she's also the only daughter. This fact plays a huge role in other versions of this story. In the 12 brothers, she would be the 13th child, a number that is considered unlucky. And before she's born, her father, the king, decides that if she ends up being a girl, he would have all his sons killed so that she could inherit the kingdom. Honestly, you don't see much of that in fairy tales, because normally the king prefers their male heirs to inherit their thrones. I suppose he gets points for wanting his daughter to thrive and become queen, yet loses a lot more for being a horrible father to all 12 of his sons. Anyway, when his 13th child turns out to be a girl, all 12 of her brothers are forced to flee their home. In the 7 ravens, the daughter's birth indirectly causes the brother's curse. When she's born, she is sick, and fearful that his daughter will die before getting baptized, her father sends his sons to get water to perform the ceremony. When the brothers fail to do this, their father becomes angry and curses them himself. In other versions, if it's not an evil stepmother or their own father who curses them, then the sister ends up cursing them by accident. Either way, as soon as she finds out about her brother's tragic fate, she is determined to seek them out. She walked the whole night long, and next day also without stopping, until she could go no farther for weariness. Then she saw a forest hut and went into it, and found a room with 6 little beds, but she did not venture to get into one of them, but crept under one, and lay down on the hard ground, intending to pass the night there. That doesn't seem smart, but whatever. Just before sunset, however, she heard a rustling and saw 6 swans come flying in at the window. They alighted on the ground and blew at each other, and blew all the feathers off, and their swan skins stripped off like a shirt. Then the maiden looked at them and recognized her brothers, was glad and crept forth from beneath the bed. The brothers were not less delighted to see their little sister, but their joy was of short duration. "Here canst thou not abide," they said to her. "This is a shelter for robbers, and if they come home and find thee, they will kill thee."
"But can you not protect me?"
asked the little sister. "No," they replied. "Only for 1/4 of an hour each evening can we lay aside our swan skins, and have during that time our human form. After that we are once more turned into swans." The little sister wept and said,
"Can you not be set free?"
"Alas, no," they answered. "The conditions are too hard. For 6 years thou mayst neither speak nor laugh, and in that time thou must sew together 6 little shirts of starwort for us. And if one single word falls from thy lips, all thy work will be lost." And when the brothers had said this, the 1/4 of an hour was over, and they flew out of the window again as swans. First of all, that's quite the contrast to what the queen had to do to curse the brothers in the first place. As far as we know, she didn't have to keep silent for 6 years. I suppose curses are harder to break than they are to start. Second, in the Wild Swans, the task is more painful for Eliza, which is the name that Anderson gives her in his retelling. Otherwise, she's mostly unnamed in most variants. In Anderson's version, Eliza must spin stinging nettles into flax to make the shirts, a task that blisters her hands and feet. On top of that, if she were to speak before her task is complete, then her brothers would die, so the stakes are a lot higher for her. And them, as a matter of fact. The maiden, however, firmly resolved to deliver her brothers, even if it should cost her her life. She left the hut and went into the midst of a forest, seated herself on a tree, and there passed the night. Next morning she went out and gathered starwort and began to sew. She could not speak to anyone, and she had no inclination to laugh. She sat there and looked at nothing but her work. When she had already spent a long time there, it came to pass that the king of the country was hunting in the forest, and his huntsmen came to the tree on which the maiden was sitting. They called to her and said, "Who art thou?" But she made no answer. "Come down to us," said they. "We will not do thee any harm." She only shook her head. As they pressed her further with questions, she threw her golden necklace down to them, and thought to content them thus. They, however, did not cease, and then she threw her girdle down to them, and as this also was to no purpose, her garters, and by degrees everything that she had on that she could do without, until she had nothing left but her shift. Did she just strip for them? The huntsmen, however, did not let themselves be turned aside by this, but climbed the tree and fetched the maiden down and led her before the king. The king asked, "Who art thou? What art thou doing on the tree?" But she did not answer. He put the question in every language he knew, but she remained as mute as a fish. As she was so beautiful, the king's heart was touched, and he was smitten with a great love for her. He put his mantle on her, took her before him on his horse, and carried her to his castle. Then he caused her to be dressed in rich garments, and she shone in her beauty like bright daylight, but no word could be drawn from her. He placed her by his side at table, and her modest bearing and courtesy pleased him so much that he said, "She is the one whom I wish to marry, and no other woman in the world." And after some days, he united himself to her. Yep, that sounds about right in regards to the development of a romantic relationship in fairy tales. She's hot, he's rich, boom, married. The king, however, had a wicked mother who was dissatisfied with his marriage and spoke ill of the young queen. "Who knows," said she, "from whence the creature who can't speak comes? She is not worthy of a king." Ugh, gosh, in-laws. After a year had passed, when the queen brought her first child into the world, the old woman took it away from her and smeared her mouth with blood as she slept. Then she went to the king and accused the queen of being a man-eater. The king would not believe it and would not suffer anyone to do her any injury. She, however, sat continually sewing at the shirts and cared for nothing else. The next time, when she again bore a beautiful boy, the false stepmother used the same treachery, but the king could not bring himself to give credit to her words. He said, "She is too poised and good to do anything of that kind. If she were not dumb and could defend herself, her innocence would come to light." I realized that I just read the words, "the false stepmother." I've read this story before, but I don't remember this woman being referred to as a stepmother, just the king's biological mother and the young queen's mother-in-law. Did this story forget how she was related to the king, or is this a different version than the ones I've read in the past? Or, rather, did I just not pay attention to the previous times I've read this story? Either way, any of these could be possible. I just never noticed that before. In most older drafts of the Grimm stories that involve stepmothers, such as Snow White and Hansel and Gretel, it was their own biological mothers who caused their children harm, not their stepmothers. Obviously, these drafts were rewritten with evil stepmothers instead of evil birth mothers. And I wonder if the sudden change of this phrase in the story is somehow referencing that. Otherwise, I'm reading too much into this and just wasted a minute or two rambling about this. Anyway, back to the story. But when the old woman stole away the newly born child for the third time, and accused the queen, who did not utter one word of defense, the king could do no otherwise than deliver her over to justice, and she was sentenced to suffer death by fire. When the day came for the sentence to be executed, it was the last day of the 6 years during which she was not to speak or laugh, and she had delivered her dear brothers from the power of the enchantment. Well, that's convenient. The 6 shirts were ready, only the left sleeve of the 6th was wanting. When therefore she was led to the stake, she laid the shirts on her arm, and when she stood on high and the fire was just going to be lighted, she looked around and the 6 swans came flying through the air towards her. Then she saw that her deliverance was near, and her heart leapt with joy. The swans swept towards her and sank down so that she could throw the shirts over them, and as they were touched by them, their swan skins fell off, and her brothers stood in their own bodily form before her, and were vigorous and handsome. The youngest only lacked his left arm, and had in the place of it a swan's wing on his shoulder. In most versions of this story, the sister has the closest relationship with the youngest brother. In the 12 brothers, he is the only brother with a name, which is Benjamin, and he saves his sister from the other brothers who, because of her, went on this whole kill every girl we see mindset, which gets thrown out the window as soon as they're reunited with their sister. In the Wild Swans, the youngest brother cries on Eliza's blistered hands, and his tears relieve her of any pain. You would think that his shirt would be the first to be made, but I guess she makes them from oldest to youngest. In most cases, like the one in this story, she doesn't have enough time to finish the sleeve of the last shirt, which goes to the youngest brother, leaving him with a swan's wing instead of an arm. They embraced and kissed each other, and the queen went to the king, who was greatly moved, and she began to speak and said, "Dearest husband, now I may speak and declare to thee that I am innocent and falsely accused." And she told him of the treachery of the old woman who had taken away her 3 children and hidden them. Then, to the great joy of the king, they were brought thither, and as a punishment, the wicked stepmother was bound to the stake and burnt to ashes. But the king and queen, with their 6 brothers, lived many years in happiness and peace. With that, we end the tale of the 6 swans. Honestly, this is a fairy tale that I want so badly to be made into a Disney movie. I feel like it deserves to be more well-known. Fight me if you think that Disney is done with princess fairy tale movies, but I love this story so much. Ever since I was first introduced to this story through the Wild Swans, I have always admired how kind and brave the sister was to go through so much pain to free her brothers. She has the courage that I hope I display whenever my own siblings need me to help them. Although if they need me to shut up for a certain amount of time, then they're screwed. The fairy tales that I tend to enjoy the most are the ones in which the main character, mostly a maiden, goes through so much suffering. Like in the case of Cinderella, I can relate to these strong fairy tale characters and know that any struggles that I go through will be rewarded in the end, one way or another. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who finds comfort in these kinds of stories. While it's not the center of the story, there's some romance in this tale, something that I'm a total sucker for. Their love is tested when she can't prove her innocence, and I certainly hope he has a big apology prepared after what happened. I know I made fun of it earlier, but I still love it. All I need is more development in their relationship for any modern adaptations, which I have seen, by the way. Okay, this next part is completely improvised, something that I didn't have originally when I wrote the script for this episode, and something that I feel like I needed to talk about because it sounds important, and I'm literally recording this part of the episode like the day before I want to post this episode. But anyway, some of you might be wondering, whatever happened to the stepmother? I'm not talking about the evil mother-in-law, I'm talking about the evil stepmother from earlier who cursed the brothers in the first place. Apparently we don't know. However, I have noticed that in some modern adaptations, specifically the ones I've seen, such as an episode of Grimm's Fairy Tale Classics, as well as an episode of Jim Henson's The Storyteller, I noticed that both the evil stepmother and the evil mother-in-law will be basically turned into one character. So she curses the brothers in the beginning of the story, and later on in the story, she becomes she somehow frames the queen, our young heroine here, for child murder, basically. And I could have sworn that I read somewhere that they basically are the same character, but I could be getting that confused with like something I read about Hansel and Gretel. But that is a story to save for another time. So, anyway, yeah, I just thought I should mention that because I didn't know if anyone would be wondering, hey Kayla, aren't you gonna mention the part where the brothers go back to their kingdom and get rid of the evil stepmother that cursed them in the first place? No, apparently the story doesn't think that's important. So, anyway, that's just how it goes. But if you want a more definitive answer, then I don't know, watch that episode of Jim Henson's The Storyteller. I actually like that series, so I'd give it a watch. Anyway, that's all I had to say. So let's wrap this up now. Back to the originally scheduled podcast. I hope you all enjoyed the Six Swans. If you did, then please use your magic arrow to shoot that like button and subscribe for more fairy tales. What other stories should I read by the Brothers Grimm? Let me know in the comments. Until next time, my friends, may all your dreams come true and fare thee well. Mwah! Bye-bye!